Everyone heard the engines before they saw the ship, the sky over the dusty colony, turning black with the shadow of a cruiser that did not belong here. People in the market looked up with fear in their eyes. The sound was like thunder rolling over. Cracked rooftops, shaking old windows, the children were pulled back into homes, doors were slammed shut, merchants tried to hide what little they had under rough blankets, their hands trembling as they moved too slow. When the ship finally landed, the ground shook under the weight of its steel body. The engines hissed as they cooled down, sending clouds of dust across the market, and for a moment, everything was hidden in a dirty mist. It was the kind that burned the eyes, the kind that made people cough and wipe tears that were not just from the dust. And then the ramp came down with a heavy thud, and silence fell over the market. Like a heavy blanket, the only sound was the hiss of the hydraulics and the sharp clicking of boots on metal. As the soldiers came down first, their armor black and scarred, their faces hidden behind tinted visors, weapons strapped across their chests, they formed two lines and stood waiting, eyes fixed straight ahead. And then he came down last, the Galactic General, himself tall, broad-shouldered, his coat sweeping the ground as he walked. He wore no helmet, his cold eyes taking in every trembling merchant, every mother clutching her child, every old man trying to shrink back into the crowd, his mouth twisted into a small smile as if he found the fear amusing. He walked through the market with measured steps, his boots leaving prints in the dust. Every step felt like a warning. The air seemed to shrink around him like it was afraid. Two people turned their eyes down to avoid meeting his gaze, but he looked at each of them, studying them like a butcher looking at livestock, the smile never leaving his face. As he moved behind him, the guards followed, silent shadows with hands near their weapons, waiting for the smallest sign from him to act, to take, to hurt, to break. He stopped in front of a fruit stall where a young man stood shaking, holding a basket of bruised vegetables. The young man tried to bow, but his hands were shaking so badly that the basket tipped. A single red fruit rolled from the basket and landed at the general's feet. The young man froze, his mouth opened, but no sound came out, his eyes wide with terror. As he looked up, the general looked down at the fruit, then looked back up at the young man, that cold smile growing just a little wider. He lifted his boot and slowly pressed it down on the fruit, crushing it under his heel. Red juice spilling into the dust. The sound of the fruit breaking under the leather boot was louder than any shout could have been in that silence. The general turned his head and looked around the market, watching as everyone saw what he did without saying a word. He told them all that he could do what he wanted, that nobody would stop him, that fear was the only law now. As he continued to walk deeper into the market, the crushed fruit behind him, like a small silent grave for hope, Mira held the crate of vegetables close to her chest, her arms aching under the weight, her back already sore from the long morning at the fields. She moved carefully through the crowded market, hoping to get back to her mother before the heat became unbearable. Her mother had been coughing all night. Mira could not risk her getting weaker, not now, not with the baby growing inside. Her each step was heavy, but she forced herself to keep going. She forced herself to breathe and to hope that today would pass quietly. She did not see the soldiers at first, did not see the black boots, did not see the glint of weapons under the bright sun. She was only focused on keeping the crate steady, her mind counting the steps to her mother's home, counting the coins in her pocket, praying it would be enough for a small bag of herbs to help with the cough. The people around her started to move away, slowly, as if the air had turned to ice. She felt the shift in the crowd before she saw him, the way people turned their eyes down, the way they pressed themselves against the walls to avoid being seen. And when she finally looked up, she saw the Galactic General walking straight toward her, his eyes sweeping over everything like a cold storm that did not care who it destroyed. She froze for a moment, her feet unable to move, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break through her ribs. She tried to step back, but the crowd had closed behind her. She tried to turn, but the crate was too heavy, and in that moment her foot caught on a loose stone, and she stumbled, the crate tipping forward, the vegetables rolling across the dusty ground. One of the fruits rolled and hit the general's boot. The market seemed to gasp together, the sound of the fruit hitting leather echoing louder than the engines of his ship. Mira dropped to her knees, trying to gather the vegetables back into the crate, her hands shaking as she picked up each one, dust clinging to the tears that fell from her eyes. She tried to speak, tried to say she was sorry, but no words came out. Her mouth was too dry, her fear too thick. The general looked down at her, his shadow falling over her as she knelt in the dirt. She could feel his eyes on her like knives on her skin. She could hear the soldiers shifting behind him, the soft metallic clicks of weapons being gripped tighter. As they watched, Mira pressed a hand to her belly. As she tried to stand, the baby moved inside her, a soft reminder that she was not alone, that she had to protect the small life growing inside her. She looked up into the general's eyes, her own eyes wide with fear, but somewhere in that fear was a small spark of defiance. She would not bow, she would not let him see her break. The general tilted his head slightly, the cold smile on his lips growing as he lifted his boot and wiped the crushed fruit from the sole against the ground. He looked down at Mira like she was nothing, like she was less than the dirt under his boots, and then he took a step forward, the soldiers behind him following as the market held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The general stood above Mira, his shadow swallowing her small trembling body as she pressed her hand against her belly. The market was silent, every breath held every eye on them, but no one moved, no one dared to speak or take a single step closer. As the heat of the day pressed down heavy on their shoulders and the dust hung in the air like smoke, Mira tried to stand. She tried to keep her eyes down to show she meant no disrespect, but her legs were shaking and her arms were weak from the weight of the crate and the fear pressing into her chest like a stone. She looked up for just a moment, just enough to see the cold eyes of the general looking at her like she was a stain on his boots, like she was nothing but a mistake in his path. Then, without a word, the general lifted his boot, the black leather catching the light as it rose higher and higher, until Mira could see the dirt on the sole, the small pieces of crushed fruit sticking to it. Before she could move, before she could protect herself, before she could protect the small life inside her, the boot came down it, hit her in the stomach with a force that made her world go white for a moment, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp cry that was lost in the heavy silence of the market. She fell backward onto the hard ground, her hands clutching at her belly as the pain exploded through her body. Like fire, tears filled her eyes as she gasped, trying to breathe, trying to keep the scream inside, because she knew if she screamed they would take everything else from her. The people around her flinched, but they did not move. They turned their faces away. Some of them closed their eyes, unable to watch but too afraid to help. The general looked around at them, his cold smile growing as he saw their fear, as he saw their weakness. He turned back to Mira, who was lying in the dirt, her hair spread around her like a dark halo, her hands shaking as she held her belly, whispering softly to the child inside that she was sorry, that she was so sorry. The general leaned down slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, as he reached out and grabbed the edge of the crate, pulling it away from her vegetables, spilling out again onto the dirt, rolling away into the crowd. As people stepped back, the soldiers behind him laughed softly, a sound that was colder than the silence that came before. Mira tried to reach for the crate, but the general kicked it away, sending it crashing into a nearby stall, the wood splintering as it fell and the last of her food scattering across the ground. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing through the pain, feeling the dust on her lips, the taste of blood in her mouth, as she promised herself she would not cry, not in front of him, not in front of them. The general stood up straight, looking down at her one last time, before turning his back on her, stepping over her like she was nothing but another piece of dirt on the ground. The soldiers followed him, their boots sending up small clouds of dust with each step as the market slowly began to breathe again, but the fear stayed heavy in the air, as Mira lay there in the dirt whispering to her baby that she would not let this be the end. Myra lay in the dirt for a long moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps, as she tried to understand the pain that was burning through her body, the heat of the ground pressing against her cheek. As the dust settled around her, she could taste the blood on her tongue, and feel the sting of tears in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She refused to let the fear and pain take everything from her. As she pressed her hand against her belly, whispering softly to the child inside her, telling them it would be all right, even though she was not sure if it was true around her, the market began to move again. Slowly, carefully, as if everyone was afraid the general might turn back to look at them, as if one wrong breath might bring the boots of the soldiers back down on them. People picked up their baskets and crates, their eyes down, their hands shaking as they tried to pretend they had seen nothing, tried to pretend they had heard nothing, tried to pretend that Mira was not lying there in the dirt. An old woman watched from behind her stall, her wrinkled hands clutching the edge of the table, her eyes dark with something like sorrow and something like fear. She wanted to move, she wanted to help, but her feet would not listen to her heart. She turned her face away as a soldier glanced in her direction, and she forced herself to focus on the bruised fruit in front of her, because looking at Mira meant remembering what fear tasted like. A young boy hiding behind a broken crate peered out at Mira, his small hands covering his mouth to keep the sound of his breathing hidden. His eyes wide and wet as he watched her struggle to sit up, watched her hands trembling as she tried to gather the scattered vegetables back into the broken crate. She moved slowly, every breath sharp, every movement careful, as she tried to protect the child inside her even as the pain tried to steal her boy wanted to help. He wanted to run to her and give her the small piece of bread in his pocket, but he saw the soldiers standing at the edge of the market, their black armor shining under the harsh light, their eyes hidden but their hands close to their weapons, ready to strike if anyone dared to move, if anyone dared to help. Mira finally managed to sit up, her hair falling over her face as she breathed in the dust in pain, her hands moving across the ground, gathering the bruised vegetables, pressing them to her chest as if they were the last pieces of hope she had left. She looked around the market, her eyes meeting the eyes of the people who quickly turned away, pretending they did not see her, pretending they did not hear her soft whispers to her baby, that she would not let this break them. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying for a moment as the world spun around her, her hands clutching the crate to her chest, her breath shaking as she took one step and then another, her eyes focused on the narrow path ahead of her as the soldiers watched her walk away, their cold smiles hidden behind their visors as they turned back to their general who was waiting at the edge of the market. Mira did not look back. She did not let herself see the fear in the faces of the people she passed. She kept walking, each step a promise to herself and to the child inside her, that she would not let the darkness of this world swallow them, that she would keep moving, even if the pain tried to stop her, even if the fear tried to break her. She would keep moving because she had to, because she had no other cope. The boy watched Mira as she walked away, her figure small against the dusty road, her steps slow but steady as she held the broken crate close to her chest. He could see the way her shoulders shook with every step, the way she paused to catch her breath, the way her hand pressed protectively against her belly as if she was holding the world together with nothing but her will. And the boy felt something burn in his chest, something stronger than fear, something that made his small hands curl into fists as he watched her disappear down the narrow path toward the edge of the colony. When he was sure the soldiers were no longer looking, when he was sure the general was gone, the boy crawled out from behind the crate and ran through the narrow alleys, his bare feet kicking up dust as he moved faster than he ever had before. He ran past the abandoned houses, past the broken fences, past the old market gates, and into the hills where the dry grass whispered against his legs like the voices of ghosts trying to hold him back. But he did not stop because he knew he could not stop. The boy climbed the rocky path that led to the caves high in the mountains, where the wind was sharp and cold and the sky felt closer, where the people who had refused to bow to the general had disappeared months ago and never returned. The boy knew where they had gone. He knew the stories of the hidden fighters who watched the colony from the shadows, waiting for the moment they would return to take back what was theirs. When he reached the mouth of the cave, he stopped, his breath coming in harsh gasps, his small hands on his knees as he tried to calm the pounding of his heart. He looked into the darkness and called out, his voice cracking, as he shouted that he had news, that he had seen something that they needed to know. For a moment, there was only silence, only the wind whistling through the rocks and the beat of his heart in his ears. And then a figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and silent, with eyes like cold fire and scars across his hands that told stories the boy could not understand. The man knelt in front of him, his eyes searching the boy's face as he asked what happened. The boy swallowed hard and told him everything. He told him how the general had come, how the soldiers had taken the food, how the general had kicked the pregnant woman and laughed while she lay in the dirt, how the people were too afraid to move, afraid to help, how the woman had gotten up and walked away, holding her belly, holding the last pieces of hope in her shaking hands. The man listened without speaking, his eyes darkening with every word the boy spoke, his jaw tightening as he looked out toward the colony below, where the general's ship was still casting its shadow over the homes of the people who had learned to live in fear. And when the boy finished speaking, the man stood slowly, his eyes cold and sharp as the wind, as he whispered a name under his breath, a name that the boy recognized, a name that made him take a step back in awe, because it was the name of the warrior, the name of the man who had once led them to freedom before the general came, the name of the man who had disappeared into the stars, but who had promised to return if they ever touched what was his. The name was Kale. Far beyond the colony, beyond the dead moons and the shattered rings of ancient worlds, a small ship moved through the dark. the stars reflecting off its battered surface like cold fire inside the ship. Cale sat in silence, his eyes closed as he listened to the hum of the engines, the steady pulse of the ship that had carried him through wars and victories and losses that left scars deeper than the ones on his skin. He had left the colonies long ago, had left the fight behind him, trying to find peace in the emptiness of the stars, but peace was a lie that never stayed for long. The message came in the middle of that silence, a small blinking light on the console, a signal from the colony he had once called home. He opened his eyes slowly, reaching for the device with hands that were steady, even after everything he had seen. He pressed the button, and listened to the broken voice of the boy. The fear in it, the urgency, the way it shook as he spoke of the general, of the soldiers, of the market, of the woman who had been kicked while she held her child within her. Cale did not move for a long moment as the message ended, the silence returning to the small ship like a blanket, trying to cover the storm that had begun to rise in his chest. His eyes stared into the darkness of space, but he did not see the stars. He saw her face, he saw her eyes, the way they looked at him when she told him to live, to find peace, to leave the fighting behind. He saw the promise he had made to her to never return to that darkness unless they ever dared to touch her. Cale stood slowly, his movements quiet but heavy with the weight of the past. He moved to the small compartment at the back of the ship, pressing his hand against the scanner. That opened with a hiss, revealing the dark armor, the insignia still etched into the chest plate, the symbol that had once made armies tremble, the symbol that had once been a promise of protection to those who could not protect themselves. He ran his hand over it, remembering the battles, the sacrifices, the victories that had come with too high a price. He began to put on the armor piece by piece, each piece fitting against him like it had never left him, like it had been waiting for this moment. Just as he had the helmet last in his hands, heavy and cold, he looked at his reflection in the dark visor, seeing the man he had tried to leave behind, seeing the war in his eyes that never truly faded, and he knew that the time for peace was over. Stepped into the cockpit and sat down, the armor shifting around him as he took the controls, his fingers moving over the panels with practiced ease as the engines roared to life, the stars outside beginning to blur as the ship turned toward the colony, his eyes never blinking as the light of the distant sun reflected off the visor. He whispered softly to himself, a promise that was sharp and cold and filled with the fire of the war that lived within him. They touched her. The market was quiet under the heavy heat of the day, the air thick with dust and the weight of fear. The people moved like shadows, their eyes down, their voices low as they tried to live under the boots of the soldiers who watched from the corners of the streets, their black armor catching the sun like a threat. The general stood at the edge of the market, his hands behind his back, his eyes cold as he watched the people crawl through their days, as he listened to the silence that was louder than screams. Mira sat inside the small room, her back against the rough wall, her hand pressed against her belly as she breathed through the pain that came in sharp waves. Her mother sat beside, her hands shaking as she wiped the sweat from Mira's forehead, whispering prayers under her breath, prayers that felt empty in a world that had forgotten. Mercy, the baby, moved inside her, a soft reminder that she was still alive, that she was still fighting even when it felt like the world was trying to crush her. Outside, the wind began to change the sky, turning a deeper shade of blue as the clouds pulled across the sun, the shadows stretching long across the ground. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their hands moving closer to their weapons as the air felt different, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something they could not see. The general narrowed his eyes, looking up at the sky, as the first sound reached him, a low rumble that grew louder and louder until it felt like the ground itself was shaking. The people looked up, fear in their eyes, as the black shape broke through the clouds, moving fast and low, the engines roaring like thunder across the roofs and walls. The ship circled, once the symbol on its side flashing in the light, a symbol that many recognized even if they had only seen it in stories, a symbol that made the soldiers freeze for a single breath. A symbol that made the general clench his jaw as his cold eyes watched the ship land in the dust outside. The market gates, the engines cut off, leaving a deep silence in the air. As the dust settled, the ramp dropped with a heavy thud, and the shadow stepped out, the armor black and marked with the scars of battles fought long before these soldiers had even learned to hold their weapons. The helmet lifted for a moment, revealing eyes that burned with a cold fire before dropping back into place. The symbol on the chest plate catching the light as Cale began to walk toward the market, each step heavy, each step a promise. The soldiers raised their weapons, shouting commands, trying to form lines, but their voices shook and their hands trembled as Cale kept walking, his steps calm, his presence cutting through the fear like a blade. The people watched from behind the stalls, their eyes wide as they recognized the man who had once fought for them, who had once protected them, who had once disappeared into the stars with a promise that he would return if they ever touched what was his. Cale stopped at the edge of the market, his eyes on the general, who stood in the center, his soldiers around him, weapons raised and ready. The general smiled, but it did not reach his eyes as he called out to Kyle, asking him who he thought he was to come here, to challenge him, to stand against him. Alako lifted his head, the visor reflecting the fear in the soldier's eyes, as he spoke, his voice calm and cold. Her husband. The silence after those words was sharp enough to cut the wind. The soldiers stood frozen, their weapons trembling in their hands as they looked at Kale, the black armor, the cold fire in his eyes, the promise in his voice. The people behind the stalls held their breath, their eyes wide as they realized who he was, the stories they had heard as children. The stories of the man who had once stood alone against an entire fleet. The man who had disappeared into the stars to protect the woman he loved. The man who had sworn to return if they ever touched what was his. The general felt the weight of those words, but his smile did not fade. His eyes sharp as he took a step forward, his boots kicking up the dust as he spoke, his voice smooth as he told Kale that this was his world now, that these people belonged to him, that everything here was under his control, and that no ghost from the past would change, that no husband, no father, no hero would save them from the power he held in his hands. Tilted his head slightly, the visor reflecting the image of the general standing there with his soldiers around him, the rifles shaking in their grip, the fear in their eyes hidden behind the thin layer of duty. Kale did not speak, he did not move, he simply reached to the side and pressed a small button on his wrist. The sound that followed was soft, almost like a whisper, but it carried through the dust and fear and silence like a promise from the hills above the colony. Shadows began to move, figures stepping out from the rocks and caves where they had hidden for months, the fighters who had refused to bow to the general. The ones who had been waiting for a sign, for a signal that it was time to rise, the ones who had trained in silence, under the cold stars, waiting for the return of the man who had once led them into freedom. They moved like shadows down the hills, their weapons ready, their eyes burning with the fire of a freedom that had been stolen from them. The general turned, his head sharply as the first shots were fired into the air, not at the people, not at the soldiers, but at the sky. A signal, a declaration that the time of fear was ending. The market exploded into movement, the people running for cover as the soldiers tried to form lines, shouting orders, trying to aim their weapons as the fighters from the hills swept into the market, moving like a wave around Kale, who still stood there, his eyes on the general. The general lifted his weapon, pointing it at Kale, his finger tightening on the trigger, his smile cold as he told Kale that he would die here, that he would watch the people he claimed to protect fall before him, that he would watch the woman he loved break under the boots of his soldiers just as she had before. Kale lifted his head, his voice calm, as he spoke over the screams and the chaos as the fighters clashed with the soldiers in the market as the dust and smoke filled the air. Not today. On with that, Kale moved his steps, silent as he closed the distance between him and the general, the world around them exploding into battle as the people watched, the moment that would change everything, the moment the promise returned to the colony, the moment fear met the fire of a husband who had come back for what was his. Kale moved through the dust and smoke like a storm, his armor catching the light as the fighters cleared a path around him, their weapons raised, their voices shouting commands as they pushed back the soldiers who were stumbling under the weight of their fear. The market was alive with the sounds of freedom, with the sounds of a people who were no longer afraid to fight, with the sounds of a promise being kept. As Kale stepped toward the general, who stood frozen for a single breath before, rage twisted his face and he lifted his weapon and fired. The shot hit Kale in the chest, but he did not fall, the armor absorbing the impact as he kept walking, the ground shaking with each step. The general fired again and again, each shot echoing across the market as the people watched with wide eyes as the man who had once been their hope kept walking through the storm, through the fire, through the fear, as if the bullets were nothing but dust against him, as if the darkness around them could not touch him. Kyle reached the general in a breath, in a heartbeat, in a moment that felt like the world had stopped. The general swung his weapon like a club, screaming as he tried to fight the fear in his own heart. But Kale caught the weapon, with one hand, his grip like iron, as he ripped it away and tossed it to the ground. The general stepped back, his eyes wide as he realized that this was the end, that the fear he had given to others had finally returned to claim him around them. The soldiers were falling, the fighters moving like shadows through the market, taking back what had been stolen from them. The people were rising from behind the stalls, from behind the doors from behind, the fear that had held them down for so long, their voices lifting as they saw the man in the black armor standing before the general, as they saw the hope they had lost return in the form of a promise kept. Gil grabbed the general by the collar, lifting him off the ground with one hand, his visor reflecting the terror in the general's eyes as he struggled and screamed, calling for his soldiers, calling for the power he once believed would protect him. But no one came, no one answered, because the fear was gone. The fear had been broken by the return of the promise, by the return of the husband who would not let them break what was his. Kyle spoke only one word as he looked into the general's eyes, a word that was softer than the screams around them, a word that was heavier than the silence that followed mine. And with that, Kale dropped the general to the ground, turning away as the fighters surrounded the men who had once believed himself untouchable. The people gathered around, watching as the soldiers surrendered, dropping their weapons as they realized the fight was over, as they realized the fear was over, as they realized that freedom had returned to the colony. Kale walked through the market, through the people who reached out to touch him, to thank him, to cry in the presence of the man who had returned to them. He did not stop, he did not speak, he kept walking until he reached the small room where Mira lay, her eyes opening as he entered, her hand reaching for him. As tears filled her eyes, Kale knelt beside her, lifting his visor so she could see his eyes, so she could see the promise in them, so she could see that he had returned, that he had kept his word, that he would always protect what was his. And as she placed his hand on her belly where their child moved between them, he whispered softly, "I am here."